So lots of people are getting into 3D scanning, and I have used it in the past on some of my favorite projects. I unfortunately can't share the behind the scenes of that project, but what I will say is that I think some people misunderstand why you might 3D scan something in the first place, and in today's video we're going to scan some of the sourdough that I made and showcase some of the workflows I did with my friend Jonathan Winbush and show you when, why, and how you might approach 3D scanning for a project of yours. Hopefully this will save you some time. So to prove my point, sourdough is just one of those things that has a lot of surface detail and imperfection that is very organic, and it's really hard to capture that in 3D and digitally. And while I was going through this exercise, we reached out to the chef, the digital chef, the expert of food 3D renders, Patrick 4D, and he said that bread is notoriously hard to recreate digitally and procedurally. So that being said, I think that combining 3D scanning with some manual workflows will be the best bet most of the time. The first thing to think about is really, what are we using this 3D object for? Is it a hero object? Is it something in the background? The past projects I've worked on, a lot of the 3D assets that we would use would be background assets, as in we don't really get close to them, but they're there to invoke the same primary form, the same camera blurred silhouette, and the overall color vibe to help set the mood. But having a 3D scanned asset as the hero asset might not be the best option most of the time, because what I've found is that you either are going to spend a lot of time trying to recreate that, or you might as well just do some of the manual work and retopologize it and retexture it yourself. Now, I am a little biased because I have been diving into 3D modeling and texturing and Substance Painter, so maybe this is I am self-serving biasing my preference to doing actual manual work of 3D modeling versus 3D scanning, but they both take an equal amount of time to get really good results. So to give you an idea of what 3D bread should look like, here's some photos that I've taken of my bread, and without further ado, let's go into the process of actually scanning some bread and trying to get a good looking 3D model of sourdough. To make the most photorealistic bread, we obviously need to start with scanning it, so Jonathan Winbush did come over to my house. I set up all of my lights, my Aperture f22C, my Aperture 120Ds, and I have way too much photo, video, stuff, equipment, but it helped us get a really good scan because we had really even, soft lighting. And that's really important for good scanning, whether you're using a hardware scanner like Jonathan Winbush was using, or you're doing photogrammetry like what I'm gonna do later in this video. Winbush was using a scanner called Creality Rapture, which I think is a play on words, but all that being said, it's a device that uses LiDAR and photos and does everything in the device, versus the method I did, photogrammetry, definitely took a lot more time because we had to take like 1,000 photos to get enough data for us to process the scan for the bread that I made. He really didn't have to do much. He kind of just like pointed the thing at the bread and just kind of did his thing while I was getting ready to do my photo scan. And then once I jumped in, I set up my camera, my little remote, and I just like hit the button and then rotated the thing on the Lazy Susan and just took like 1,000 photos. And it took a really long time. So Winbush did leave with his scan and I had my photos, so for me it was time to process my bread and actually do some photogrammetry things. And that involves using reality capture. Now before we talk about 3D scanning and reality capture, I should mention that I was shooting all of my 3D scans on my Sony a7S III. The Sony a7S III is a 12 megapixel sensor and it really excels at doing video, but because it's a 12 megapixel sensor, it's a much smaller image. It's about like a 4.5K image versus my other camera, which is unfortunately being repaired, is a A7 IV, and that is a 30 megapixel sensor if I remember correctly. And I will admit, I probably would have gotten better detail on my bread if I used a higher megapixel sensor. And I think that's one of the first things that a lot of people don't think about when it comes to getting really good 3D scans. The size of your sensor does matter. If you look at some of the content that Clint does with his 3D scans, they look great super close up versus mine, not so much. So before we even talk about reality capture, I think it's worth mentioning that the type of camera that you use will probably have a very large impact on the quality of your 3D scan. Now, regardless of the camera, you obviously need a bunch of images to process in Reality Capture, so I did just that. I did bring all of my photos into Lightroom and process them to be as evenly lit as possible. While we did use really nice soft lighting in our little home studio space, we did have to process all of those images, really just take out a lot of the contrast and some of the baked natural shadows that happen when you take a photo. So we adjusted some sliders, lifted the shadows, brought down the white so that the bread didn't have a lot of harsh, contrasty parts of our image. Now, I will say, for me personally, I feel that when you desaturate the images a lot, the bread kind of looks flat. And then when you render it in post, it's gonna look a little flat as well. So I think in the future, what I'll do is probably increase the saturation a bit more, or just be okay with a little bit of the contrast. After processing the photos in Lightroom, we had to bring them into Reality Capture. And I'm lazy, and I just hit the start button at the top, and it kind of just did its thing. Now, it didn't give me the best result to start, so I did actually go back and watch both Clint and William's tutorials on how to do better 3D scanning. And this is what I came up with after I watched and restudied their tutorials on how to do good 3D scanning. While I did revisit and study their tutorials a lot, I did form some of my own opinions on 3D scanning. And as such, as someone who uses ZBrush a lot more, I know someone is going to hate me in the comments for saying this, but I do think ZBrush and Substance Painter and, dirty word, retopology is the right way to go for really good processing of your 3D scans. No matter what scanner or method of scanning that you're using, it really just comes down to we need to extract this data into a 3D object. Get it into an OBJ or an FBX or however you need to work, and then import it into the 3D software of your choice to start processing your 3D scan. In this video, I'm going to be using ZBrush, but you could do this in Blender, Cinema4D, Maya, whatever you're more comfortable with. This bread scan that I have is about 1 million points, so I'm gonna go ahead and start with retopology in ZBrush. The process of retopology is simple for this. I just went into ZBrush and just hit Z-remesher on it, and because bread is a really simple shape, it did a really good job for our retopology purposes here. Right now it looks kind of gross, but if I go to my super high poly version, hey look, in ZBrush it looks like a piece of bread. Now this is the high poly version. This is about 1 million points right here, versus I have a low poly version that is about 6,000 points. Now from here, before we do anything else, what we need to do is also turn back on our other mesh. So we'll unsolo this, and we're gonna see here that the low poly version doesn't quite hug or follow the shape as much as the high poly. So I'm gonna go to my tool panel, go to my subtool, and then under subtool, I'm gonna go to project and project all. Now we don't want to apply our poly paint yet. The reason why our mesh is currently textured in ZBrush is because Reality Capture did create our mesh and our texture using vertice data. It's putting all the color onto each vertice, which is why it's so many polygons as well. That helps with maintaining that color data. But right now we're only working with the low poly, so we're not going to apply the poly paint yet, but we're just going to project the details so all the low polys try and hug the high poly mesh as much as possible. Now with this, I'm going to go to my little plus square down here. I'm going to divide this by like 5 times. Now we're at 1.5 million points. Now don't be afraid, we're not going to use this in 3D software for rendering. We just need this for the high poly data. We are going to go back to our subtool panel, go to project, and under the subtool project panel, we need to make sure that this color option right here is on, because now what we're going to do is project all of the color data onto the high poly version. So with color on, we'll hit project all. Now we do want to hit yes in this scenario. So let's hit yes and let ZBrush think again. So with that done, we can turn off our wireframe and see that we have a really good looking texture on our bread scan, which is exactly what we want. Now with good topology also comes decent UVs. So I have my mesh here, and the ZBrush for iPad currently doesn't have a ton of awesome UV features, so I'm gonna kick this off into Cinema4D and do my UVs there. To do that, I'm using ZBrush for iPad and GoZ to just send my bread from the iPad onto my desktop version, and now we have it in the desktop. and it's just as simple as bringing our object from ZBrush into Cinema. And if we want to do the easiest and cheatiest way to do our UVs, we can go to the automatic tab, go to our polygon mode, select everything, Control A, and packed. And now we have at least some UVs that we can use to make our texturing easier. These seams aren't going to be perfect, but they're going to allow us to get the detail that we need to texture this in Substance Painter. So to get our texture of our high poly scan onto our model that we can use in Substance Painter, we have to go down to the Texture Map tab. Now from here, we're going to hit New Texture, and it's going to get rid of our texture. We're going to go to Create, and we're going to go to New from Polypaint. And fortunately, because we did project all of the detail from our high poly scan, which is going to be this guy right here, they look pretty much identical because we projected all of the polypaint data from our high poly mesh onto our subdivided UV'd mesh, which will allow us to be able to texture this in Substance Painter. To get our texture map out of ZBrush, what we have to do is go to the Texture Map tab, and we have to click on Clone Texture after we've made our texture map. Once we hit Clone, it's going to appear on the left side here on the ZBrush tab. We can go to Texture and go to Export Texture, and we'll just put this somewhere on our computer. Finally, we need to export our mesh from ZBrush into an object that we can actually paint in Substance. To do that, we'll go up to our Subtool panel, make sure that we have our object selected that we want to export into Substance, turn off the high poly one. We don't need the scan data anymore. We'll hit Shift D a couple times to go down to the lowest poly version. We're going to go to our Z plugin and just export this as an FBX using our FBX export import tools. We also need to make sure that we export the high poly version for baking in Substance because we're double baking this bread. To do that, we're going to take our mesh, hit D a couple times on the keyboard in ZBrush to make sure we're at the highest subdivision level, go to export, and we will rename this one, or not overwrite it, but we need to make sure that this high poly version is called high instead of low, because it's the high poly version. This will take a little bit of time because we're exporting a ton of points, and typically an FBX is not used to handling this many points, but we're just using it to get some really good detail on our bread. Speaking of getting details, going into Substance Painter now. Substance Painter will help us get the best textures for our 3D scan. So we'll take this, drop it into Substance Painter, set the resolution to 4K because we can, obviously, and hit OK. Now when we go ahead and take a look at our bread here, we can see that it looks a little chunky, but we're going to fix that by baking. To bake in Substance Painter is to go up to the little croissant button and then basically project all the high poly data from our actual high poly version onto the low poly version. We can do that by hitting the little croissant up here and then selecting our mesh. Substance might take a second to think about this, but we can see that in Substance we have a little cage around our mesh now. And what we can do is decrease this cage until we don't want to see any red, but just enough so that it hugs it as tightly as possible. Basically, we're projecting all of the normal data from the high poly onto the low poly into a normal map. So we'll hit Bake Selected Textures, and we're going to bake this bread again. As this bakes, we can see that it's adding a bunch of extra little details, and when we go back to the Painting tab, we can see that we have an awesome looking version of our bread, but it still looks white and gross. We need to apply that texture map that we made from ZBrush. We're going to go ahead and find that texture that we exported from ZBrush, drop it into Substance, and make sure that we define it as a texture. When we do that, we're basically saying, hey, Substance, this is a texture. We're going to apply it to our model. Hit Import, and then we'll make a fill layer, and then take this bread scan texture and drop it into the base color. And we can see here that it looks weird and gross. Why is that? Well, ZBrush is also sometimes weird, and what we have to do is uncheck the tiling button right here, the lock, so that we can get access to the Y property and set this to -1, and now our bread is applied to the correct orientation for our texture. Awesome. So from here we have this bread, and now there's going to be a ton of different ways we can apply our extra detail to our mesh. That might include creating some procedural noises, that might include doing some metal edge wear, dirt maps, etc. to help create that extra detail that we can't really capture in photogrammetry or 3D scanning. I have found that it's not giving me the roughness, normal map, displacement map, directly out of the scans, we have to do some hacky stuff. William Faucher does talk about some of this in some of the reality scan tutorials. Again, it really depends on how you want to work. I kind of like this workflow because I can change it if my client decides we need to make a change. As I said, we have to go through the process of texturing this in Substance. So if you have questions on that, let me know in the comment section down below on if you'd like to learn more about how I would texture something like this. But basically, we're trying to make this look as real as possible using the Substance viewport. Now with all of the work done, we can finally look at our 3D objects, and they all look like bread. They look like this. Some of them look exactly the same, but the point I'm trying to make is optimization. And when it comes to optimization, it really comes down to what are we using this asset for? If we do not care about optimization, we can very well go ahead and use this one. Look how dense this mesh is. It looks fine, but let's be real, when you get this close and personal up to an object, no matter how big your polygon's small or big, the texture's just gonna look kind of gross and weird. Versus if you go to maybe this one, where I didn't do a whole lot of texture work, it looks kind of jank. Versus if you go to this one, where I applied the most texture detail in height and normal and all the fun stuff, we can see that we're getting a little bit more detail relative to this one. And all that is to say, I don't think 3D scans are the solution all the time. They're a fun exercise, but sometimes I think we are afraid of like sitting down and like getting into the nitty gritty of like texturing and doing the work that's boring that will ultimately give us a better result. I wanted to make a long-winded rant video because I'm learning a lot, and I feel that there's all these avenues that we could start going down, when in reality what we should care most about is what does the final image look like. And however we get there, sometimes we need to do some of the boring grunt work that kind of sucks. But I wanted to share this to hopefully save you some time, because I've definitely wasted a lot of time trying to figure this stuff out. And hopefully you learn that it's not just point a camera and take 1,000 photos or 3D scan something and then you get a perfectly awesome scan. That's it. Thanks for watching. If you found this rant, this video, this vlog useful, let me know in the comment section down below. Questions, comments, concerns, whatever else, comment section is down there for that as well. And as always, 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight makes some. Goodbye, my friends. Bye. Hope you like the new office. Bye.
Oops.
Uh-oh. Was that a phone? That was a phone? Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's got good. It's the old one. Yeah.